to Liz Sews and day 2 of the Cindy Longline bra tutorial. Today we're going to start sewing things together. I hope you guys are excited. So I always like to start my bra with the cup first. So I'm going to bring up my cup, one of my cups. This is another way that can help keep you from mixing them up and putting the wrong thing on the wrong cup. So here's of course where my pin is. That's going to be my center front. So I'm going to take these two pieces and I'm going to pin them together along this curve. I'm going to sew mine with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Of course, that is because I have removed that excess seam allowance. If you are using the pattern as it was drafted, you're going to sew this with 1/2 inch seam allowance. So now I have everything pinned into place. I'm just going to take it over to the machine and sew this with the straight stitch. So I've got this lined up in my machine, and here I have it with the 1/4 inch marker on my presser foot, or you'd be using 1/2 inch if you didn't alter your pattern. So this is what it looks like once we've sewn that seam. You can see it's just a straight stitch all the way across. Then we're going to open this out and top stitch our seam allowances down. So I like to push my seam allowances towards my underarm, and because we marked this piece knowing it's the center front, that means I want to make sure to top stitch on this side. And I'm going to use a straight stitch again, and I'm going to be about 1/8 inch from my original seam line. So I've lined my fabric up in here, and I've just butted my seam line against this inner edge of my presser foot, and that gives me about 1/8 inch. You do want to make sure that you have all of your seam allowance on kind of finger pressed over to the side where you're stitching so that you're capturing it. So once we top stitch it down, it should look like this. Now we know that the side with the pin in it is our center front, and I pick up my upper piece, and yes, that's what this side should be, the center front. You might have this flipped over like this, and because you have your pin in it, you know that it needs to go this way. If you're looking at it, the two pieces with the more exaggerated curve, that should be what attaches to your upper cup piece, and then the more softer curve is what's going to be your wire line, if you get that confused. So now we're just going to attach these two pieces together, and it's a little bit tricky because they are opposing curves, but I like to just line up my two edges and then work towards my center when I'm pinning. Now once again, I'm going to sew this at 1/4 inch with a straight stitch, though if you have not altered your pattern, you're going to sew this with 1/2 inch and a straight stitch. So here's everything pinned together. Now you will have to ease just slightly on this curve because one is a little bit longer than the other, but if you're using a two-way stretch fabric, you see that it's really easy to ease that part in. So you just pin it with that excess, and then as you're sewing, you just make sure that you're sewing that flat together. But know that there will be some easing required on this to get these two curves to work. Okay, so we brought this over to the machine. I'm going to sew with 1/4 inch and a straight stitch. If you have left your pattern unaltered, you're going to sew with 1/2 inch straight stitch. So here we have what it looks like when I've sewn that on. And just like we did for the lower cut piece, we are going to flip this out and then top stitch our seam allowance down. Now I kind of just decide which way I want to top stitch it down based on how the fabric is behaving. I think with this one, I'm going to want to top stitch it down on the upper cup piece. So I'm going to want that seam allowance going towards my head. I think that's what's going to lie the flattest, because if I try to go it down like this, we're going to have a lot of excess fabric in there. So yes, take this over to the machine, make sure your seam allowance is pointing towards your upper cup piece, and then do a straight stitch at a scant 1/8 inch. Now I'm doing a scant 1/8 of an inch for my top stitching, though if you do have your 1/2 of an inch seam allowances, so those much bigger seam allowances, feel free to do like a 1/4 of an inch for your top stitching. You just want to make sure that you are getting through all layers of the fabric at once. So once you've done your top stitching, it should look like this. Now we can probably take this pin out because it's going to be really obvious to us, which is the center front of the cup. So we don't really need that anymore. And here's what it's going to look like from the inside. You can see my line of top stitching is just make sure I cut everything down. Now you see at the end here, I didn't do it exactly great. I sort of lost this second layer. I could go back and top stitch this again, but it's right at the very edge, right where my wire is going to be. So I think I'm just going to leave it as is. I don't think anyone will see it. So that's what the inside of the cup is going to look like. And so for this one, contrary to a lot of my items that I've sewn in the past, I'm going to leave this one without any lining in the interior. So these seam allowances are just going to be exposed. So you just need to repeat everything I've shown you on the second cup. So here we have 2 cup pieces complete, and they should just be sort of mirror images of themselves. So I'm going to set these aside and work on the band. So for the band, this is super simple because we've sort of eliminated all of those extra pieces. We're just going to take our fashion fabric that goes in the center front and then attach our 2 power mesh pieces along this short seam, and we're just going to use a straight stitch at 1/2 of an inch. So here's what it looks like once that's sewn together. Next, we're just going to top stitch this down, and because I do have a 1/2 an inch seam allowance here, I'm going to give myself a good 1/4 of an inch for my top stitch. So it's going to be a straight stitch about a 1/4 of an inch from that seam. So here we have our band complete. So the last step today is just going to be inserting the cups into this cradle. So for the cups, I'm just going to go one at a time. I'm going to look at them and figure out where it goes. So this cup, we have, this is our center front, so that's going to be what's against our bridge. And then I just pin this into place. Now you will notice the top of our bridge is unfinished, as well as the top of our cup here, and that is fine because it's going to be finished with fold over elastic later on. So I like to pin these into place. This cross cup seam where the bottom cup is split should line up with where your power net and your fashion fabric meet. So that's going to be another area where I pin, and then I will line it up on the far side as well. So now I have 3 pins in here. One at the center front, one at that cross cup seam, and then one at the edge. And now I'm just going to backfill and pin the rest of this in here. Now again, unlike most bras, this one does require some easing to get it to fit in, but as long as you are using the stretch fabric that the pattern designer had intended, it should fit in here quite easily. So you can see here I've got almost all of my ease in that one spot, so I'm just gonna readjust that a little to make sure that it's sort of spread over the whole length of that curve. This bra does feel very different than most of the ones I've made because it is so stretchy. So this bra, while it doesn't have as much support as some of the other ones that I've shown you because it's not rigid, it's definitely really comfortable. I think it's a good bra just to have around. I think I like to have a wide variety of bras. I don't want all of them to be that sort of like armored support system. sometimes it's nice to wear something that's just a little bit stretchier and more comfortable. So now that I've got that cup all pinned into place, I'm going to take this over to the machine. Now, if you'll remember, along this wire line is the last place where I've cut down my seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch. I do find that the wire line in particular is really hard to do with a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. So if you don't change any of the seam allowances, I would really recommend changing this one. So I'm going to use 1/4 of an inch, but again, if you're using your pattern as it's printed, you're going to use a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance for this. And we're going to use a straight stitch. So here we have our cup all sewn in there. And this is what it looks like from the inside. So I'm going to leave these seam allowances open. However, later these are going to be covered up with our underwire channeling. So I just need to put in the other cup the exact same way that we've done this one. So we've gotten the band put together and the cups and then set them into the cradles. So hopefully you'll come back tomorrow and we will start working on the elastics that go along the bottom and the underarm and neckline. That concludes day 2 of the Cindy Long Line Bra tutorial. I'll see you tomorrow.